We'll now proceed with our next session on the topic Climate Risk and ESG, Fortifying Investment and Portfolios Against Future Risks. I am extremely delighted to welcome the panelists to the dais. Shri Sunil T.S. Nair, CGM, Department of Regulation, Reserve Bank of India. Shri G.S. Rawat, DMD, NABARD. Shri Binod Kumar, ED, Punjab National Bank. Madam Richa Arora, Managing Partner and CEO, ESG Solution, eCube Investment Advisors. And our moderator for this session, Shri Aniram M, Managing Director and Partner, BCG. May I request Shri Anirban M to initiate the panel discussion? Yes,
Thank you so much for having us here and for setting up this panel for discussing on the need to fortify investments against future risks. So before we get into the panel discussion, just wanted to share a bit of context because from the sound of it, protecting investments against future risk is something that financial institutions have been doing since ages. So why? Why are we having this discussion here today? And why has this topic percolated into boardrooms, especially of late? So just to give a context, when we are talking about future risk, we are talking about future risks linked to climate and nature, or the broader ESG theme. And that has three types of risks. One is the physical risk to investment assets and portfolio. One is the transition risk, which is happening because of the changes in different energy types, in changing regulations. And the third one is an investment risk. And how do you invest in emerging technologies? So just a few slides, 3 or 4 slides, just to lay the context of why are we talking about these now. This is a chart of the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. We are running against time. We have a limited budget. Every COP, whether it was COP 26 in Glasgow, 27 in Egypt, or 28 in Dubai, will increasingly talk about how this is leading to more and more loss and damage. The loss and damage vocabulary was introduced last year. This year, we are expecting that to start getting into a more firm framework. Numbers range from 200 billion of loss and damage that's happening today to about $1 trillion of loss and damage that is expected by the middle of the century. So there is a here and now, clear and present impact that we are facing, and this is driving a lot of the regulations. But more importantly, this accelerates the risk that assets are facing today. Now, on the back of it, there is a pressure to transition, that we have to transition into low-carbon businesses with an accelerated speed. But transition is something that has happened always. Again, why is that new? So for that, let me just take you back maybe a few million years, that we have had transitions in the past. We transitioned from stones to fire about 1 million years back. We transitioned from fire to domestic farming through animal mechanical energy about 10,000 years back. Then fossil fuel came in. Last 2,000 years, we have transitioned to fossil fuel. And now we are trying to transition out of fossil fuel. The only difference is these transitions, including the transition that we have seen in this century, that is transitioning from coal to oil and gas, happened over hundreds of years. The transition that we are talking about has to happen over the next 10 to 20 years. And it is not because we have found a more efficient source of energy, it is because we have to transition for the sake of climate. And that brings new risks. How do you transition at a such fundamental level across the board at a global scale with so limited data and such less tested technologies? And that brings the investment risk into focus. How, as financial institutions, can you start underwriting new technologies that can be adopted at scale? So finally, bringing our focus into the double materiality that banks and financial institutions have with climate. On the one hand, we are dependent on climate. Today in the panel, we have development financial institutions which have exposure to agri and rural. And agri and rural is one of the most vulnerable sectors. As India, we have been told to be the seventh most vulnerable country in terms of the climate impact. So there is an impact on our portfolio. And there is an impact on the sectors that we operate in because of regulation changes. But there is a second part of this as well, which is the sectors that we finance, they contribute to climate risk. And therefore, there will be more and more regulatory pressure on who you can lend to, who you can't lend to. And then there's the third risk, which is the sectors that are emerging, the low carbon. How do you start lending to those sectors, which are very different asset classes, very different risk return portfolios, and very limited data. So therefore, today's discussion, I'm looking forward to it because we have with us a commercial lender, we have a mandate-focused, agri and rural-focused development bank, we have an ESG advisory with a broader worldview of how different banks are organizing themselves, and with Mr. Nair, we have the regulator. So to get the discussion started, let me start with you, Mr. Kumar. At the onset, how do you perceive these risks that are getting talked about, that we have to pay more attention to than we have in the past? And how material do you think, especially in the context of a country that has to balance our climate ambitions with our growth targets?
Thank you, Anirban, for setting the context. First of all, there are many things happening in the climate, and do we still understand these things are happening because of the climate risk? I say a few examples of the recent past, like crack in Josimat. Do we perceive it is because of climate risk? One hydropower project washed out in the northeast. Do we understand it is because of the climate risk? And then flash flood in Himachal. Do we understand it is because of climate risk? So these are the risks we are associated with. If we don't change, risk is huge. We cannot even imagine. Mr. Anirban showed you two data. I am adding more data to that. In the last 70 years, glacier has rate of melting of glacier is more than 20 tons per meter square. Sea level has risen by 100 millimeter in just 25 years. So imagine if these things are not contained. The prediction is this temperature rise, which is at present 1.25, it will go up to 4%. It is unbearable even at 1.25. Then what will happen if temperature rise by 4 degrees centigrade? As per ILO estimate, by 2030, if temperature will rise up to 1.5, then working hour loss is 2.2%, which translates to 2.2 trillion. So that is the loss we are incurring if we don't contain all these emissions. We already talked about transition risk, then physical risk. There will be torrential rain, there will be flash flood. And we will imagine maybe we think it is not because of the climate risk. It is not because of the emission we are doing. So everybody need to be aware of the risk we are going through, and everybody will have to rise to the occasion. Everybody should try. Government has set a target of net zero by 2070. Everybody should try. Every organization should try to be net zero. Only then that target can be achieved. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kumar. Let me come to you, Mr. Rawat, on the point of vulnerability. And it is now a proven fact, India, or for that matter, the larger global south, which historically has not contributed so much to the emissions, but are the most vulnerable. And when we come to vulnerability, the segments of society with least income, with least resources, the rural and the agri sector are considered to be the most vulnerable, to whom you have both a mandate and a high exposure. So I wanted to get your thoughts on how you are looking at this space from a climate risk perspective.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for having me in this panel and giving this opportunity. We all know the severity and the frequency of the climate change events that's taking place during the last 1 decade it has increased tremendously. And if you see, agri sector is the most vulnerable, as you mentioned earlier also. And within agri also, small and marginal farmers, the number that we have for small and marginal farmers. So setting the context, I'll give you one example. We have 50% dependence on rain for all our agri activities. Out of that, if I say irrigation, about 9 million diesel pump sets are there. And the cost and the emission it creates, you can imagine how it is. Now, remaining 50%, if it is rain dependent, we want to convert that diesels to solar, so that is just not sufficient. Diesel to solar is one, then solar to micro irrigation, linking it to micro irrigation is another. Then micro irrigation to sensor-based delivery of irrigation to improve the efficiency. So just converting from diesel to solar will not be sufficient. If you really want to improve the efficiency and de-risk our entire agri sector, so this whole gamut of solar to micro irrigation, linking it again from micro irrigation to sensor-based. So that is the whole context. But then it entails additional cost, the capital cost that it will incur. So from that perspective, if we see the cost-benefit ratio, so if the irrigation efficiency increases from, or if you can save water up to 60-65% by using solarization, micro irrigation, and sensor-based irrigation, if we save 60-65% of the cost, at the same time increase our production from monocropping to double cropping, or from one crop to two crop, then it evens out. But the challenge is upfront capital cost, and also whether our small and marginal farmers, whether they can actually afford it. So that's the challenge, and that's the risk perception we have. That's why I think there is a need for a lot of convergence, because government, state government, in fact, almost all the state governments have a state action plan for climate. And then there are schemes or initiatives like green credit. So all these things converging, all these initiatives of government, and then there are many innovations that is coming from the agri-tech companies, agri-startups, which are giving good solutions to these risks or these aspects. Secondly, individual farmers, small and marginal farmers may not be in a position to have that initial capital investment to that extent. Then the collectivization of farmers. So that is another area that we have to see. So I see as a part of risk, especially in the agriculture sector, how do we leverage different initiatives of state governments and government of India? How do we leverage the different initiatives or the innovations that is coming up from the agri-tech startup companies? And also learning from various other countries, how they are addressing these issues. So I think these are some of the areas, my thoughts on this. So this is what broadly we need to address on these areas and work on.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Rawat. And I know as NABARD you are looking at some innovative ways to address that, so I'll come back to that. But before that, the point you touched upon, let's hear a little bit about more broader global examples. And if I come to you, Richard, that as you have seen this across different companies, but also different geographies, a couple of points I'll say that Mr. Kumar and Mr. Rawat made, which I found very interesting. One is the acknowledgement. We are seeing a lot of climate events. Is that happening because of climate change or not? And I think the school is still a little divided on that. Not everybody is on the same page as maybe the panel here is today. And the second is to be able to act on it, you have to first acknowledge the cost of inaction, which is very difficult to quantify. So how much capital you put behind, how do you really measure the impact? The cost of inaction is difficult. So wanted to get your thoughts as you see this in a broader ecosystem. How much is the acknowledgement that yes, there is a clear and present danger that we have to act on it? And second is how ready are banks and financial institutions, not just in India, but maybe outside as well, to start organizing themselves to tackle this risk?
Yeah, firstly, good afternoon, everybody. A pleasure to be here. Uh, first, just touching upon the risks which the panel was talking about, and I think acknowledging the fact that climate risk is a hardcore economic issue. It's not something fuzzy. It's not something which is happening to others. It is not something I'm not responsible for. It's actually a pressing economic issue. And various figures were shared in terms of projections. Actually, if you look for the data, it is there. So if you look at latest report of the International Meteorological Organization, and they've said in 2022 itself, the estimates of the loss of GDP in India is about 4.2 or 4.5 billion US dollars, right? And this is the past. Of course, RBI has made projections for the future also, but I think there is enough data out there if you choose to look for it. The point which you highlighted in your overview, Anirban, about CDP estimating that the financed emissions are 500 to 700x of scope 1, scope 2. So the question is, I'm sure many banks are represented here, how many banks today in India are really looking at even scope 1 and scope 2? Some of them are single digits, low single digits to my knowledge, and hardly any for scope 3. Okay? Now, it's ironic that without the scope 3, there are banks who are making net zero projections. So it doesn't add up, because if you're not taking scope 3 emissions and financed emissions into account, how you're arriving at a net zero target. So I think there are those real issues today, which is not to say that we'll not get there, because let's also admit that Europe and the developed world has been ahead on this over the last 2 decades. And we are just reaching a point of inflection with all the regulation with SEBI and RBI, kind of SEBI especially in the last few years, the guidance which has been there for companies. And so we are just about starting there. But I think the first thing is to acknowledge that it's an important economic issue, and that banks need to start looking at what the financed emissions are. I think globally what one sees banks is, and all of them, whether you take Deutsche Bank or you take, you know, the DBS, or you take Societe Generale, you take all the leading banks, they have gone beyond the stage of looking at scope 3. I mean, they are all in the process of looking at scope 3 emissions. They have set industry-wise targets for scope 3 emissions, because that's the only way you're going to create impact, if you kind of disaggregate that. They've also interestingly taken targets for themselves as a bank, that my emission factor in 2030 or 2040 is going to be 100 grams per kilowatt hour versus a baseline, and so on. So they're really kind of taking that to its logical level. Also saying that exposure to, let's say, industries like upstream, oil and gas, target of today it's 40%, you're going to reduce this to 30% by 2030 and 20% by 2040 and versus a baseline. So I think those are the kind of things being done. But this will not happen in a vacuum. And that's where I think governance structures kind of really come in, I would say, play a very significant role, because one of the things some of the global banks, and not all of them, but they're all moving towards that, is that this silo approach is kind of going out of the window. So they're forming teams where you have not just the risk CRO and the CSO, but you also have corporate banking, investment banking, all working as a single unified cross-functional team to ensure that their clients who they are lending to are making this journey. So they are not taking a passive approach. They're not saying this is not something not in our influence, this is not something we cannot control, but proactively working with the people they're lending to help them achieve their transition plans. Now, when it comes to India, I think boards, and we work with some of them in the area of just familiarization with sustainability, broader area of sustainability and climate change. I think it's a mixed bag. So I liken it to the product diffusion theory. So there'll always be a bunch of innovators, then there's a bunch of early adopters, and then early majority, late majority. So we are at that innovator, early adopter stage in terms of companies who are genuinely doing things, right? So the rest of it, so if you talk to CEOs, for example, most CEOs you talk to will say, if I have to look at climate finance, climate change plans and sustainability, who's going to run the business? So that comes from the, I would say, misplaced belief today that this does not impact business, that climate change and having a plan will not make any significant impact on my business, so why should I spend time on that? Let me run my business. So the fact that the two are two parallel tracks, which you have to look at as an ongoing journey. Like business is an ongoing journey, right? You don't kind of say, I will do these two things and business will happen. You're continuously working at it. So is the case with things like having a climate change agenda, having a sustainability plan, having an overall approach to deploy it. And so you do see even at boards, I would say, and there's data which says that about 2/3 of board members don't believe it impacts business. So I think a lot of the work has to be around, and some of the work which we do is basic awareness of what sustainability is, what is ESG, what is climate change, and helping them make the connection. So as the old adage goes that familiarity breeds favorability, as you talk actually, boards do start appreciating, understanding, and then empathizing with therefore what needs to be done. But again, you can't stop there. It's got to be implemented. So governance at the management level, then how do you kind of percolate it down to everybody so that the vision of the company and the CEO is down there on the ground too with every employee. I'll take a pause there because, I mean, one can talk a lot about this.
No, but one point that you make, and let me come to Mr. Nair, I think we are all keen to hear from him. So one thing is clear, that there is still a world moving at different paces when it comes to acknowledging, measuring, and acting on climate and nature risk. So much that we would like everybody to act from the goodness of their heart and do the right thing, we have seen this globally, as Richard was also saying, is that it will always be led by mandates, by regulations, to get everybody on the same page and to act in a cohesive manner. And that's where your role comes into the picture, and possibly even more central, because you have two very, very distinct priorities to balance. One is to guide us towards the right pace at which financial institutions have to act, and the other side, whatever act you take has a very direct impact on the lending side of the business, which is the heart of the economic growth. So, Mr. Nair, as you look at, you've now seen, you've released a discussion paper, you have a pulse of how different banks and companies are thinking. How do you see this playing out for India?
Good afternoon, and thanks for the invitation to be part of this panel. I don't know how to get started because a lot of views coming from our colleague from NABARD. Richa also spoke about something. Vinod Kumar spoke about something. So to set the tone, I think when you look from the perspective of Reserve Bank of India, I think we look from the perspective of the regulated entities. So when I talk of the regulated entities, it essentially means banks, NBFCs, and whosoever come under our purview. So, because you hear a lot, I think Fed Jerome Powell spoke some time back saying that, or some Fed colleague spoke saying that it is not central bank's mandate to get into this business, it is somebody else who will run the show, and central bank can be a kind of enabler but not kind of taking the lead there. And in other extreme, you have Europe, who is kind of going all out and trying to come out with regulations even much beyond what the standard setting bodies are. So when we look from Reserve Bank's perspective, and more so from the perspective of regulated entities, what is the worry? I think the worry is we should worry that the soundness and the stability of these regulated entities is intact. So when I say soundness and stability of the regulated entities, which has in turn an impact on financial stability, and when I talk of the climate, right now we are factoring credit market, op risk, and all kind of risks. So now you have this new element of this climate thing coming in. So if I were to factor in that climate risk, or I were to embed it into the risk which I am trying to capture, to give an hypothetical example, like if I am lending to an X person As of now, I doubt whether anybody factors in the climate part into it. They lend, they look at the credit part of it. So if the climate risk aspect has to be factored into, as of now, you don't have a mechanism whereby we can arrive at the probability of default or LGD, given the fact that climate is a non-linear phenomenon. It is not a backward-looking kind of thing wherein I can look backwards and try to say that this could be a PD. So essentially, if I am trying to lend to a person for an housing purpose, and if it happens to be a place where it is prone to certain natural disasters, of course, data is available. So then the first job when I'm trying to analyze or I'm doing the credit appraisal is I need to build in that climate component there and try to look at that part. So, but as you rightly pointed out, when we did a survey somewhere in Jan 22 and the results are in public domain, what we found is like what Richa told, many of the banks are not aware of that. When we spoke very simple questions, we asked like what is their view on climate risk? Do you think physical risk is a risk itself? Do you think transition is a risk? So many of them were kind of, you had a mixed crowd, like some of them were leaders because of the parentage, the foreign banks, they were ahead of the curve, but most of other entities were not kind of aware of that. And then we came out with a discussion paper which you referred to, which was broadly in terms of the expectations which we had from the regulated entities. So there, the survey showed us where the banks or the regulated entities are, and the discussion paper was an ambition kind of thing, asking bank that this is what we want from you. So when you marry that, and what was the discussion paper trying to talk about? As I told some time back, we are worried about the soundness and the stability part. So there are some 3-4 pillars there. Number one, I think first of all there needs to be clarity on what is green and what is brown. So taxonomy is kind of a badly needed thing. Globally, if you look at many of the jurisdictions have a taxonomy. In India right now you don't have a taxonomy. You have a taxonomy because India did come out with the sovereign green bonds and there they had listed out certain sectors. So there you can say loosely it's a taxonomy, number one. Number two, you need data. You need data for what? Like for a bank, it's very okay. You told that climate is a risk. How do I kind of assess? How do I kind of get a sense of what is the kind of risk sitting on my books? Because ultimately, if risk is sitting on my books, I need to have that much amount of capital. And as on date, the standard setting bodies are not very clear in terms of the capital requirement. They are still working on it. For the people who are aware in the audience, there is a concept called Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. Pillar 1 is something which is mandatory. Like in India, Reserve Bank says 9% capital has to be maintained, means I lend 100 rupees, I have to maintain 9 rupees as capital. Pillar 2 is, suppose, even if I have not mandated the capital requirement, but when a supervisor visits a bank and he finds that you are carrying risk beyond what is prescribed, then he can mandate you to maintain additional capital. So when it comes to the climate risk part, as of now, the standard setting bodies are of the view that it's a pillar 2 kind of a thing, whereby if you feel that you are carrying risk much beyond what is prescribed and climate is one of the components and you feel that you would be taking a hit, then you maintain additional kind of capital, be it in form of buffer or whatever it is. So that's where standard setting body. Now coming to the banks and FIs part. So banks will need data, they will need to get a sense, they can do something called scenario analysis and stress testing. Look at their books, look at various scenarios, these physical risks happening, these scenarios, transition risk happening at this, I think NGFS is an entity called Network for Greening of Financial System. They have prescribed various scenarios. Using those scenarios, you can look at your books and see that, yeah, this in a worst case scenario, this is the impact which I will have. So if that were to materialize, do I have sufficient capital? To give an example, supposing I'm sitting at point X now, and I want to grow at a rate of 10% or 15% in RWA terms over a period of 3 years. Now, that is a business as usual scenario. Now, if I factor in this climate risk part and if I do the scenario analysis and if I'm seeing there is a hit there, then maybe then I may not be in a position to grow at the 15% with the amount of capital which I have. So there, the need of buffer comes in. So that is second part, and closely linked to that is data. And lastly, I think disclosure is very, very important because banks are always in need of capital. You cannot on and off keep on going to the investors. So how do you kind of raise money? If you have to raise money, there needs to be transparency. To give an example, I think a bank, I'm forgetting the bank's name, there an investor invested 5%. And they told the bank that you cannot lend to coal-based projects, you cannot lend to this. So if for a 5% capital, If an investor coming in is saying that, you should not be lending to this area, that means transparency is a need of hour. There are investors who have the appetite, but they are kind of very ESG kind of people who will say that I will lend, but then it will come at my cost. So transparency, disclosure, data part, scenario analysis, taxonomy, these are 3-4 things. There's a lot to talk about, but I'll stop there in interest of time. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Nair. And I think that Richa opened the door to the discussion on the scope 3 emission, which is the heart of the bank. And then how do you go about organizing yourself to understand your scope 3 emission, as Mr. Nair was saying, whether it is through stress testing, through measurement, and then eventually, and the regulator can help with some enablers around taxonomy and so on. But acting on it will eventually be a business priority that has to happen for the lender, for the bank. So I'll come to you, Mr. Rawat, because Mr. Rawat, you as NABARD, you are working on possibly the most decentralized, largely unorganized sector with a lot of data challenges, but where the need for you to address the impact is possibly the most dire. So as you look at your, and I will take the agricultural sector, that as you take your farmer community, and you have, one is the production part, but there is also a post-production part, and the two are very well interlinked. And with the climate change, you are seeing an impact in agricultural yield patterns, in farmer income, in the marketing side of in the circularity and the seasonality of things. How are you thinking about, even as some of these trends are firm up for India, even as the taxonomy is evolving, even as the regulations evolve, but for you there is a clear and present need to start addressing it. How are you as NABARD thinking about addressing these risks, both in your directly as you lend, but also the broader ecosystem that you have of development banks and cooperatives? How do you see that moving forward?
If we analyze some of the reports, it says that with every increase in temperature, the agri yields are going to come down by 4.9% to about 9% over the years. So that's going to be a big hit. I mean, if you really calculate it, it may lead to about, say, 1.5% hit to our GDP, if you can calculate 18% at the contribution of entire agri sector. So, like Mr. Nair said, data is one part. Data, what type of data we have. So, what we are doing to address these issues is, one is we are strengthening our training vertical. So, we have a separate vertical in NABARD which looks after this entire capacity building activities at our head office. Then there is another vertical, our training institutions, which is actually working on a lot of pilots and lot of simulation where we can actually see what is the impact of various developmental activities that we are doing, what is the impact of the various other activities that we are doing. So we have a training setup which is being helped by GIZ also, which is bringing that sort of a technology also. Thirdly, recently RBI has also augmented and allowed us, permitted us to use a part of our interest differential fund to use for this climate change vertical. So that is one area, that is one initiative where we are strengthening through our training systems, through our funds, how to educate the people, those with whom we are working through our partner agencies, through the banks. So that is one crucial area that we are working on to address this issue related to. Secondly, there is a lot of partnership with other agencies. That we are working very closely with Ministry of Cooperation. We are working very closely with Ministry of Agriculture. We are also trying to force synergy with some of the multilateral development agencies also. So that we bring in more clarity on the data part of it, that how do you use that, how do you develop the taxonomy. So that is another area that we are working in. Thirdly, as I mentioned earlier also, because all this readiness, especially at the farmers level, individually it's very difficult to achieve. So whatever education, whatever capacities we want to build, it's very difficult to achieve on an individual basis. We are trying to work a lot through the communities. especially the farmer producer companies or the agri cooperative societies. So these are the two target areas that these two institutions, communities that we are trying to focus on. So that because climate change, if one particular, as I gave you an example of this diesel pump sets to solar and solar to micro irrigation. So one person doing it, one small farmer will not be in a position to actually adopt that technology. So, but when it's as a service, we provide that model. So maybe there may be maybe 100 farmers who are doing it, they can afford this. And if there is a agri-tech company which brings this as a service, then it's much more affordable. So that is the way we are trying to bring in this cluster approach, involving the entire communities instead of targeting one individual farmers also. So that is how we are focusing on this. So capacity building is in our focus area. And similarly, sensitizing the banks, especially the cooperative banks, because cooperative banks, our cooperative banks, they have a concentration risk in terms of agriculture lending. So if you see the overall agri lending in India is about almost 21 lakh crores. And if you see the cooperatives, although their share is smaller, maybe 11-12%, but if you see the number of small and marginal farmers they are catering to. And secondly, out of their entire book, almost 90-95% is agri. And within agri also, it's production loan only, nothing beyond production loan. Beyond production is hardly maybe 4-5%. So we are trying to educate them also that how do they diversify their entire portfolio? Because if you are lending 100 rupees to production, maybe 20-25 rupees is required for post-production activities also. So that is the key. So that is what our theme is. That is what we are looking at. And that is how we are trying to address these all issues related to. And another issue, for example, if I can give you an example. Somewhere I think you mentioned about the livestock and the cattle feed also. So cattle, I mean livestock is another area which is contributing a lot to nitric emissions. But there are now technologies and there are now mechanisms which through a bit of a feed rationing and with some additions to the feeds, it can reduce this nitric emission by almost 40%. But again, this will not happen on an individual basis. I'll just give you one example. In Maharashtra, Vidarbha region is one of the most vulnerable area in the entire state, or rather in the entire country also. And government of Maharashtra has come out with a very big scheme for promoting dairy activities. Now we are talking about most vulnerable area, and then we are talking about promoting dairy, 45, 46, 50 degrees also it goes. So now, but that is possible with the help of technology, with the help of initiatives like rationing the feed, it's possible. So there, it will not only just on the initiative of state government, it will not work. So they need capital, farmers need capital to purchase new animals. Then we need marketing assistance, so NDDB is there. We need agri-tech startup companies which will facilitate this entire procurement, health, AI services, all those things. So it has to be a convergence of different stakeholders. So if you ask only banks, maybe banks will say Vidarbha region, dairy, crop loan, monocropping, I'm not going to finance, because if you see the NPA percentage, maybe it will be high 20s in that region. But if we have an enabling provision like NDDB is coming up, some agri startup is coming up, there is some assistance from the state government to incentivize these things. So that is how it will emerge and it will be developed. And if you can bring in this integrated farming, because monocropping is, if the crop fails, then there is nothing to fall back upon. But if we bring this integration by bringing livestock and other activities, then maybe it de-risks everybody, including the farmers, including the bankers. So that is what we are looking at.
Thank you, Saurabh. And let me come to you, Richard, on the point of the banks galvanizing a broader ecosystem to drive this change. One is that you have a direct lending portfolio, but you also have a signaling effect on the market. Banks like NABARD, for example, act as intermediaries where for other pool of capital to come in and get into certain new technologies or doing some of these investments at scales, new ESCO models. It always helps to have a lender or an intermediary playing that role. But to be able to play that role, there is a need for enablement, a need for educating the bank itself and the ecosystem around it, leveraging new partnerships like startups and other that you can catalyze. So from a more of a vantage position, how do you see some good examples of how banks can play this role, which in turn benefits both their portfolio, but it also helps unlock a broader ecosystem to start moving towards encouraging these investments and a bit of the catalytic effect on capital that a bank can bring.
So, absolutely right. So, banks have a choice who they lend to and do not lend to, and that kind of drives the agenda. There's one actually small example on this, and going back a bit in time. So, because the flip side of risk is opportunity in some ways, right? So, Norges Bank, which is the investment arm of the Norwegian sovereign fund, they started looking at their portfolio of where they felt businesses were stressed because of climate risk way back in 2013. So we're talking about 10 years ago. And in 2016, their whole action of actually stopping Tata Power funding, so to say, was instrumental in that company moving towards renewable power. That's when Tata Power really started making that journey, because Norges was divesting the portfolio. I think that's a prime example of where the opportunity and the benefit is to both parties. And that there are, one can talk about multiple examples like this, but I think this is one of the most, I would say, stark ones, which demonstrate how this works to the benefit. Now, globally, I think what the banks have, and this is the crux of it, that if you're going to be reducing your exposure over a period of time to the more high emission sectors, where are you going to be lending, right? So it has to be in the pivot to green energy, hydrogen, renewables, solar, EVs, the whole gamut. It's really in some ways a mirror image of the risk. And going back to the point which Sunil was making on the data and disclosures, I think the data for banks should not be a problem, right? I mean, banks were at the forefront of the digital revolution. And they, much before digital started getting talked about in manufacturing companies and chemical companies, the kind I've been associated with. But so data should not be a problem. And once you have the data, once you know the quantum and the magnitude of the risk, you can then have actions to say that what is it that I should be doing and how should I be deploying my capital. It's like putting out a fire, right? If you have a little fire here, we're just going to take all this and douse the fire. If you have a little bigger fire, you're going to need a fire extinguisher. And then if you have a really big fire, you're going to call the fire department, right? So the data will help you get a sense of the quantum of the risk, and only then can actions come from there. And I also wanted to just actually, on the point on disclosures, I think it's a cultural thing. In India especially, we've always had this need-to-know basis. Information should be shared on a need-to-know basis. Why should we talk about this? This is competitive advantage for us. If we talk about this in our sustainability report or our integrated report, then competition will get to know our plans and things. I think that is all, past thinking. So I think those are some of the things which also hold back organizations in India. And here it's not just banks. Well, we're talking in the banking community, but it's a cultural thing, and it impacts banks also and how they look at things.
And let me pressure test the point about banks' ability to get data and act on it very quickly, and I'll come to you, Virod. We've heard two schools of thought. One is, of course, that in the new emerging technologies, banks possibly are at the best place in terms of access to data. The second is that even today, other than some specific areas, like maybe renewable generation or maybe of late green buildings, But even very established spaces like EVs, there is a hesitancy in moving faster on that. That we don't really understand what is the resale value of an EV. We don't understand what is the battery life of an EV. Technology and costs are forever changing. And those which are further far out, like different biofuels or e-fuels, that's even further out. But there is a here and now need to make these investments happen. So as a commercial lender, how do you look at this space in your ability to organize yourself, whether it's in terms of data, whether in terms of underwriting capabilities, risk? How do you see yourself needing to reorganize, or if at all, to start being part of this journey of these new technologies that are coming up at scale?
So one good thing I will share with you, whenever some proposal come to the board for discussion, where we have to take exposure on, say, coal related company or thermal power related company, then we are very cautious about taking decision whether we should do it or not. At length discussion is being done in the board, only then we take a call depending on how fast they can come out of all these things. Just to share one data with you, internally banks are doing lot of things. Last year, I think all the banks are focusing on the renewable energy, as you told, EV financing also. They are also looking for giving some incentive to retail customers, to MSME customers, where they are going for, say, green rickshaw. So some banks are coming with the incentive scheme for that. If I share my data, this year itself, we have funded around 12,000 crore to for the renewable energy sector. So all banks are aware of this. They are funding renewable energy project. They are aligned with the target of the government to create 500 gigawatt of energy through solar power to replace it. Yes, data is still, I will say, capturing data still is a challenge for the banks, because see, still that decision when I have to take a decision whether how much ESG carbon some company is releasing, and if I want to inculcate that habit in the bank proposals, in the bank decision making, still banks has to go, I mean, a long way. Banks has started thinking, they are working on it, like in our organization we are working for capturing carbon footprint of our organization. And one more thing I will share, banks are aware, this year we have targeted to plant 1 lakh trees. We have launched a scheme, PNB Plus, and we have targeted to plant 1 lakh trees. Similarly, we are also working on, banks are also working, as Mr. Nair told, scenario analysis and stress testing, because these are the things which will ultimately help us to see how much risk we are capturing in our book. But some sort of, I mean, data capturing still, I will say, it's in very nascent stage. People are thinking, some initiative have been made, some data is available, but we have to go a long way in data capturing. If we really want to embed that culture of in our decision making process, if you want to say, if I want to lend a company, I want to say ESG score of the company. So that data may not be available now, because whatever we are financing, we are, as you told, shown in the slide, we are running huge risk. So that data we have to capture, and but still that is in, I mean, very nascent stage itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Vinod. So we have just a few minutes, so I'll maybe just direct one to Mr. Nair for closure, and then we'll have, if there is any audience questions. I think just on the point that Richa opened up about opportunities, I think you spoke a lot about stress testing, understanding the portfolio, addressing risk. But like Vinod was saying, there is an element about opportunity also of banks to start lending to these new areas, where again, structural nudges do help. If you are putting it something in the capital adequacy, in the way you look at a certain sector in terms of priority and so on. So just your thought on, as you think about both dimensions of risk as well as expanding lending to new areas, how do you see the role of regulator, but also how do you see the broader ecosystem helping either data or through different nudges to have that scale?
I think couple of things here before I straight away hit your question. Number one, I think there is a need to look from the perspective of mitigation versus adaptation. Number one, there's a lot of focus on mitigation as of now. A lot of money coming in form of mitigation. A lot of money coming in form of loans rather than grants. Adaptation is a need of the hour because developing economies are facing the brunt as of now, and need for money flowing in form of grants and adaptation mixed together will help, number one. Number two, there is a need for transition finance. Like India, I think many of the industries are into these polluting, and we accept there are hard to abate sectors and stuff like that. But then the banks need to sit across the table with the corporates and tell him, okay, he comes and says, I am brown, Baba, I'm fine, but I'm ready to transition to green. How can you help me out? So there, I think sitting across, talking to them, understanding their plans and helping them out so that they can transition to green. So transition finance is a very key component. Third thing, I think blended finance, because many of the financiers are kind of risk averse, saying that why should I be the first person? So there, I think role of MDBs, role of sovereigns, role of the specialized institutions who can take the first loss. So thereby the money can flow in, the private finance can flow in is the third thing which we need to look into. From the regulatory perspective, I think there is lot of there is something on priority sector, there is something on ECB, and there are all those bits and pieces. But if you talk in terms of whether regulator needs to get into in terms of incentivizing by reducing the risk weight, I think I will not buy that argument, because even there is no consensus internationally also on that count, because it should not happen that you reduce the risk weight, you kind of then you build up a bubble, and then you kind of again go around trying to kind of prick that. So I think that should not be the case. We need to think of something else, like how best we can kind of, PSL is something which people keep on talking on and off, but that I think is already so many sectors there. Do we have much of scope there? Can we, that's again debatable. But beyond that, I think as of now, there is no consensus in terms of attacking the risk weight. Risk weight could be the best way to solve this problem, but I think not much of agreement on that count. So it would be something like the instruments which I spoke about, the transition finance and the adaptation finance, the blended finance, and looking at the adaptation part. I think that would be the way forward, which I feel. Because of course, there are jurisdictions like China and some other countries who have played around with the risk weight, but whether that's the right thing, I'm not very sure on that count. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mr. Sir. And you opened the discussion onto blended finance. Again, one big bucket of opportunity which could take another full panel discussion. But I think we're at the top of the hour. Let me stop there. We may have time for a couple of audience questions if there are any. Over there.
If you can hear me, I'll just speak without the mic. Hi, my name is Ankit. I run a climate fintech called Step Change, which works on financed emissions and climate risks for banks. And Richard, there's actually over 4 banks in India where we've measured financed emissions, so things are starting to move a little bit. But the question I wanted to ask, given so many central banks have tried different ways of approaching this problem to kickstart the banking industry to really start focusing on sustainable finance and climate risk, what are the learnings broadly from the international landscape on things that have really worked? Because everyone in India seems to be on the banking side in a bit of a wait and watch mode. As Mr. Nair was saying, no one wants to be the first one. So what has worked internationally, if there's any examples?
Internationally, I think, see, people talk a lot about saying that a lot of work happening, but since we, at least I get an opportunity to be part of these meetings of these various standard setting body, let me kind of make it very clear. Nobody has till now kind of tried to venture into these kind of areas in terms of financing and stuff like that. Left to the market, and the market takes a call. What they are trying to look at is like Europe, for example. Europe is trying to purely look from the perspective of the pillar one. They are looking at the concentration norms. They are looking at the large exposure framework. So they are very aggressive and they are onto it. On the product side, I doubt whether anybody has done anything. Of course, developing jurisdictions where World Bank and IMF would have kind of done some pilot work there. And that's why I mentioned about this blended finance and transition. And Singapore, for that matter, recently has come out with something on transition finance, a consultative paper on that. So and if you look at if you look at other jurisdictions, I think Malaysia has done a good amount of work where they have industry and all the regulators coming together and trying to develop kind of an approach whereby they go lock, stock and barrel as a country as a whole. Because this is not something which Reserve Bank or SEBI or IRD or banks alone are able to sort out. This has to be an approach where everybody comes together. Because see, you have to understand that fact that if I say steel is a bad and a hard to abate sector, I need to have a transition pathway. I need to kind of be very clear what is the transition path as far as that sector is concerned. Once that is in place, I think the regulators and other can kind of nudge or can kind of come out with regulations whereby or enable or create an enabling environment where money can flow. But to my memory, if my memory serves me right, I don't think there are any examples. There is more work happening on the prudential side, like the disclosure, the scenario analysis, the pillar 1 and pillar 2 and stuff like that. Otherwise, like China has done something, Morocco has done something, but they are kind of one-off kind of things. But otherwise, you don't have anything. And to end, I think, in the last G20 where India was the presidency, one of the priorities was to attract flows because emerging markets and developing economies are short of money. So how do you kind of attract money? So there again the same kind of concept is blended finance, transition finance, and they have given some examples like what all individually certain entities have done. So I think I'll stop there, but if my memory serves me right, no, I haven't come across globally kind of people doing anything on that front.
Richa, you want to just...
Just to kind of add that, I think where the regulators do help is in terms of defining what green is. Because you see, that is the heart of everything. Because if you say, I'm going to lend on the basis of certain data, you've got to define what is green. So in the EU and UK taxonomy, green taxonomy, both, they go down to the hundreds of industries. So for every industry, is it 10 grams of carbon per kilometer for example, vehicles, they have said something like that, 18 grams. So that is where I think probably we can accelerate, because right now we're at a very broad brush stroke starting off our journey. So that's one area which I'm sure the regulator is looking at. And I was heartened to know that 4 banks have approached you. As per the current disclosures, there are none. So hopefully we're going to see more, and that's good news. Thanks.
Thank you. Maybe one last question. Okay.
Hi, I'm Ria. From a regulatory perspective, I had a question. Historically, we have seen that when we're trying to curtail something, there have been very strict kind of regulations on that. For example, if I look at the lending restrictions, banks are not allowed to lend to companies dealing in ozone depleting substances. Okay, but now there is one. If I talk about carbon emissions, everything that I'm doing today is contributing to carbon emissions. So do you see 10 to 15 years probably down the line, there would be some kind of restrictions on companies, with high carbon emissions or leading to direct carbon emissions or, something like that? I think Richard did touch upon it a little bit, but do you see that happening?
I think I recently touched that Europe is one country which is working in terms of concentration risk. And you pointed in India, your ozone depleting substance. Right? Let us be very mindful of the fact that India is a growing and developing economy. We have to grow, and there are costs there, and we will have to live with some of these emissions. So going forward, it will happen, but it will be because another larger issue is money. Where does the money come from? As of now, if you tell banks are going to do that, you don't have that. Private money has to come from where it will come. So I think ideal thing is, let us not look from the perspective of the corporate. Let us look from the Indian perspective. Like if some investor wants to invest in India, what is he looking at? if he is looking from the climate risk or the sustainability part, what are the basic elements which have to be in place? If those things are in place, and that has to be worked from the Indian perspective, and if that falls in place, everybody falls in place, and those who have those mechanisms, they will get money. Because today you have corporates, some of them are doing extremely well, they have everything in place, but then that's not the way, because we have to be mindful of the fact there are many SMEs, small entities in the supply chain, there are small, very smaller entities there, who will handle them? So even there, I think FICCI has a major role. They have to kind of take a lead in terms of educating these industries, taking them, helping them out, because banks are going to lend, but ultimately they bank or depend on these corporates or these smaller entities. So some handholding has to happen from there and capacity building on whatever it be. But I'm sure it will happen, but it will take time. It may not happen immediately. It will take some time, but I can't quote a number as to when it will happen. Everybody is mindful of that fact, and you will hear speeches from the central bank deputy governors and governors talking on and off about this. So they are, but then we have to be again kind of at the back of mind, these issues always there, that we are a growing economy, we are a developing economy. So that I think, but having said so, I think I take your point that it will happen someday, but I can't quote a number for that. Thanks.
Thank you, Shana, and thank you so much for the panel discussion. I think we are walking away with a few thoughts in my mind. I think there is an acknowledgement that there is a need to move continuously towards better measurement, better disclosures. There is an ecosystem at play which has to come together, whether it is the granularity of taxonomy, it is the sectoral roadmap, and I think you made, Mr. Nair, the point about adaptation as a focus area that has to start coming up almost at the same level as mitigation. But as financial institutions, I think the panel here gives me the comfort that we are moving in the right direction. But thank you so much for your time, and it was great to have that discussion with you. Thank you.
Thank you, all dignitaries. Dear all, we will take 5 minutes to change the dais for the next session. I request everyone to please be seated.